day we're born, we're losing something. But what we're looking at today is not necessarily what we're losing, but I want us to look at what we're gaining. And so I'd like to, my contemplative chicken, this goes right into the first exercise I'd like you to do. I have this picture that's come to mean a lot to me during this year. And I just wondered if you'd take a moment and take a look at it yourself and just take it in. You know, what does it say to you? Do you connect with it any particular way? And if you do, if there's a word or two that you might want to chat, but just to allow yourself to be in the moment with this picture. Okay, thanks. So, anybody have a word that came to mind when you looked at that picture?
I thought of hope.
Hope, okay. I see Sister Imelda's, I see her talking, but I can't hear her.
Oh, sorry, I muted everybody. So unmute if you want to speak.
I see us lovingly intertwined.
Good. Anybody else?
Resilience.
Resilience, okay.
Connection.
Connection, okay.
Bridging.
Reaching?
Bridging.
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 Yeah, there you go.
Active.
Determination.
Okay.
New life.
New life.
New life.
Okay.
I see determination.
Okay, good. What I love about getting people's thoughts is all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I should have thought that. I should have thought of that too. And thank you so much for sharing. I'll at the end, I'll tell you a little bit why this has come to mean so much to me, because I think it represents the work that I do, and I think the work that we do. And so with that, I'd like to, let's just talk a little bit about what grief is. I mean, it's one of those words, I think we all would be able to define it. I think grief on a very simple basis is the emotional response to the loss of something or someone. And one of the things that has become very, very clear to us, I think, as a culture this year with COVID, is that we not only are acknowledging the loss of life, which is so important, but also the loss of so many things that go along with life. So mindful this year of how our COVID really has challenged our world. And I guess one way I would look at it is I think we're in the process of grieving the world as we knew it. And like any grief experience, I think COVID has been one of those experiences where, for myself, it was like I was just kind of in this denial state for a while. That's happening in Spain or Italy or New York City. But all of a sudden, no, it was happening here in San Antonio as well. And so, if you think about how grief works, I think whether it's a grief of a loss of a loved one or the loss of the world as we knew it, I think we go through a process of coming to terms with it. And if that process includes denial, if it includes questions, if it includes bewilderment, I think it all is part of that journey. So with that, I think, you are very mindful, I'm sure, that grief impacts us, not as, it just doesn't impact us on one level, but it impacts us on every level. We experience grief physically, emotionally, spiritually. And one of the things that I do support groups, and one of the things that I say almost every support group, I'll ask the question, how many of you are tired? How many of you are exhausted? I would say 75% of them say they are. And then I remind them the reason that they're exhausted is physically, they are grieving. And so grief takes about 60% of the energy that our body has. Well, guess what? We still have life to live. We still have other things to do. We still have maybe children to take care of and work to do. So it's no wonder that we are exhausted when we grieve. And so I like to remind people of that, because sometimes people are really hard on themselves. They just say, oh, I don't know, I slept 10 hours, but I'm still tired. But yeah, that's okay. So I think sometimes for those of us that are bereavement companions, I think one of the best things we can do for people is give them permission not to be okay. Permission to say, life really sucks right now, and say, yeah, it does. And that's okay. So I guess one of the things that I've learned in terms of being someone that journeys with people who grieve is to give people permission to simply be who they are and what they are. And so often, when you're in a grief space, you are in a really vulnerable space. So one of the best things that we can do, I think, is create an atmosphere where people feel safe with us. And so how do people feel safe with us? I think when they know they can share without being judged, when they know they can share without being preached at or talked to, or where they can just simply be in the presence of another human being. And I did a session today, and there was a lady there. I said, what was the most helpful thing in your grief journey? And I loved how she put it. She said, well, somebody just showed up, and I thought, gosh, that really is significant. And I often, when I do grief in services, I'll often ask people to share an experience of when someone in your life has touched you deeply. What did they say? What did they do? What do you remember? Most of us don't remember what they said, but we remember what they did. We remember they showed up. So I think, that's 60% of it right there in terms of being a bereavement companion. And then I think the rest of it is, allowing people to feel safe in that space that they are with us, so that they can express what it is that they're feeling. So one of the things that I think is so important when we process grief, whether it be our own grief or the grief of others that we're connecting with, is how important it is to remind people that if we don't tend to grief, grief will tend to us. And I guess the other image, and my guess that maybe some of you have heard this, because the whole Paula D'Arcy from Austin talks about how unattended grief is like a beach ball that you're holding underwater. Guess what? It pops up, and it'll pop up in ways that you may be surprised, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So when we don't tend to grieve, when we don't tend to our grief, I guess another way I'd put it is it tends to go underground. It tends to come up and bite us in some other way. So again, one of the things I just want to emphasize tonight that I've been doing, I guess, ever since about April, when we've been dealing so much with the pandemic, is to realize that we kind of have a parallel grief journey going on right now. If I'm processing the grief of a loved one, I'm also processing the grief of the world that I'm living in. We can't separate them. I think they both are so connected. And so, you know, for example, if you're processing the grief of someone that you love very much, maybe part of the grief of the world as we know it is that people can't come and support you. Physically, you can't go and do the things that you want to do. So to recognize loss on every level, I think is important. The large losses, obviously the large loss of physical life from COVID, but also the loss of just not being able to show up even, as I said. You know, sometimes that is so frustrating for those of us that want to show up physically. Now we've been challenged, how do we do that? And I think we have to find new ways to connect with folks. So, you know, the study of grief is really quite relatively new. It's interesting to me that really the first study of grief really came in 1917 with Freud, and he did he wrote a paper on melancholy and mourning. And what he did there is he made a distinction between depression and grief. He was trying to separate the two. But what he did at that point, and again, you know, you have to start someplace, but what he did is he basically was encouraging people to detach. He was encouraging people to forget. That's how you go forward. And that was brought home to play so vividly for me about 6 months ago when I did a workshop for Stephen Ministers. One of the questions that I asked the folks that were there, I said, what was your earliest awareness of grief? This lady, elderly, not elderly, my age, yeah, elderly. And she said, well, when she was about 7 years old, her little brother died suddenly. And what her parents did is that they immediately removed her from the house, sent her off to live with somebody for 6 months. When she came home, guess what? Everything was taken out of the house. No pictures, nothing that would remind anyone that that little boy existed. And so their intent at that point in time is they thought they were helping people by not reminding them of what had happened. And so you kind of get the sense where we get that word moving on, or, you know, closure, we need to have closure. All of that, I think, is kind of a carryover from those days of understanding grief as something that we have to detach from. So again, just a little bit of history about this journey. It was about in 1996, there was this incredible experience that came out with a book. I'm going to check the title so I get it. It is called Continuing Bonds, Another View of Grief. And it was written by these three people who really came to believe that it was just the opposite, that the way that we grieve is that we need to find an attachment with our loved one. Instead of being cut off from them, find a way to go forward with them. And so out of that came the whole sense of the continuing bond. And the continuing bond is this theory that basically says death ends a physical life, but it does not end a relationship. And so just the very things you're doing at ABODE is such a reminder of that. You're allowing that person to be in a space where family members and friends are able to physically be with them until they physically die, but as they move forward, they find ways to remain connected with them. Now, some of you have probably seen this wonderful book, and if you want to see a book that is absolutely written for children but profoundly helpful for adults, it's called The Invisible String. And basically, it's a story that a mother wrote for her twin. It was twin children she had, and she just wanted to remind them that wherever they were, if they were ever separated from her, all they had to do was tug on that string, and they would be close. And I think it's such a good reminder of what it means to have a continuous bond with our loved ones. And again, a couple other people that were part of this grief journey. In 1969, obviously, you remember, Dr. Kubler-Ross came on the scene, and she did incredible things to bring death into the forefront. And she really started us on the premise of understanding that it was okay to talk about death. But also who came along at that same time was a man by Dr. Warden, and he introduced to us the task of grief, which he said, we need to continue to work through our grief instead of forget about it. And then there was also another person, Bob Niemeyer, who said it's so important to tell our story. And that's one of the things I've appreciated when Arthur and I were working together on our presentation a few weeks ago. I just love Arthur's approach to, it's so important to tell our story. And it's important to tell our story before we die, but it's also important that we carry forward the story of our loved ones. But also, I think the way that people really, really grieve appropriately is to be able to tell their story over and over again. When I experience the death of a loved one and it's just overwhelming, how do I start to come to terms with it? I come to terms with it by telling it again and again. Had this delightful lady in a group one time, and she said, my son said, Mom, I've heard that story before. And she said, well, you're my son, you have to hear it again, so here. And I thought, what a delightful approach to how she understood her own grief. So I'm just going to ask a question at this point in time. Continuous bond, does that make sense to you? Have you heard that
Yes.
before?
No.
No? Okay. Is that new, relatively new?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's interesting, this continuous bond theory. There's a couple examples I want to share with us that, again, personally, I remember I had a dear friend that died about 10 years ago, and my brother, who lives in Silver City, New Mexico, he loves to plant trees. And my God, he's got so many trees. He's got 17 acres. And my sister-in-law says, the well's going to go dry. He waters them more than he waters us. And anyway, I called him about 3 years ago, and he was out in the yard. And I said, what you doing? And he said, I could hear water running. He said, oh, I'm out here. And he said, oh, he says, I just noticed, boy, Danny's doing really well. It looks like he's catching up with Uncle Cecil. And I thought, my God, has he been drinking the Kool-Aid again? What's going on? And then I realized he was talking, every time somebody in our family has died or a dear friend, he's planted a tree. And so what an incredible way of the continuous bond. I mean, so there he was out there with talking about, they were there, they were present. And what I loved about it was that they were still growing. They were still a part of our life. Another story that happened for me when I was actually leading one of our support groups, I was doing filling in for Celeste, and when we do the children's grief, or it's a group for folks who've lost children. And this gentleman said, when my son died, he was quite young. So every year, what I would do is we would gather as a family, and we would release balloons. And so we'd release balloons, but he said, there got to be an age where that just didn't fit anymore. So somebody said, well, what did you do? And he said, Well, he turned 21, so we all got together and we had a drink together because that's what we would have been doing at this point in time. But isn't that beautiful? It's really bringing that person forward. And that's what it means to have this continuing bond. And what I find fascinating with that is that I think then you establish, it's even like it's a new relationship with that person. It's based on them, what their memory of them, but also your connection with them in a new way. So, but that doesn't come without having to process grief. And so when we do grief groups, I often remind them that, there are these tasks of grief, and we can't just jump to this place that everything is healed and everything is okay right away. Instead, we have to recognize there are some processes. And I don't say, I don't even say steps, because I think sometimes steps people feel like, oh, I should be here and I should be there. And it's really not like that at all. But the person whose grief theory I really like a lot is Warden, who talks about the first task of grief is just accepting what happened. Second task is working through the pain. Third task is really surrendering to this new life that I now have. But the fourth task is this continuous bond, being able to establish a new relationship with your loved one and figure new ways to bring them forward as they move forward in their life. So with that, does anybody have any questions or comments about the continuous bond? It's really based on, some of you probably have heard of David Kaufman. David is a songwriter here in town. And he and I have done a lot of work together in terms of memorial services and so forth. And he actually created a CD in which he wrote a song for each of the tasks of grief. And of those tasks for grief, he wrote one called Make a New Life Here. And basically there's a line in there that I want to share with you that I think is so powerful. It's the pain of loss is the great reminder of all the love we shared. Embracing life makes sadness kinder. Take me with you everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it just reminds me that, yes, we can do that. That's what it means to grieve. To grieve doesn't mean forgetting. To grieve means finding ways to take them forward. And it's kind of like, we talk about a celebration of life. Isn't that what we do at a celebration of life service? Isn't that what it's about? And so I think one of the things that I've come to appreciate about grief work and in understanding these concepts is that I see in grief work how important rituals are. And I see how important, I think you folks do a lot of wonderful rituals at ABODE. And I think it's so significant that rituals, for example, if you light a candle, that's a ritual. Anytime you gather in a place and you remember someone, that's a ritual. And one of the things that I think I'm discovering is that in end of life, not only at the time of death are rituals important, but that first anniversary is so hard. So I think finding a ritual that again brings that person forward. So I think rituals are really that act that we do that helps us while we're in between where we're going. When you're experiencing grief, you really are you got 1 foot here and you got 1 foot here. And that's what's so hard at the very beginning. That's what makes it so painful. It feels like you're really, you're needed to be in 2 places at the same time. And I think a ritual just really kind of helps you move into that space. Think of the funeral. That's one of the reasons the funeral is so helpful, is that it helps us. When somebody said that grief is accepting the unacceptable. And I thought that was really an interesting way to look at it, because it is hard. And so when you have to accept something you don't want to accept, I think rituals can help us along the way. So any comments or questions? Beverly, did you have some questions?
We do. We have lots of questions and comments. I was just posting one here. So let's go to the top. Let's see. One of the things I posted is, how can we help our patients or our clients to start the grief process before death? Is there something we can do that's helpful?
Good question. I think allowing them to number one, simply be who they are, and to be sad if that's, and sometimes people might even not be really willing to go to that place. Accept them where they are, because, bringing people forward before they're ready to go isn't necessarily helpful. And I remember learning from a friend of mine who actually he ended up, he died, and he was a chaplain, and he gave a presentation actually at the end before he passed away, and the title of his presentation was "Thumbs Up for Denial." And what he shared with us is, if I'm in my denial, that's where I'm at, and if you can accept me where I'm at, then I'm able to move forward. And I really have come to appreciate that a lot, because I think I used to think when I first started this work that, oh gosh, if Beverly needs help getting through this stage, I got to do something. No, the best I can do is to be there with you and walk with you as you process that. So again, I think to answer your question, I think yes, there are things to do, and I think it's to be available, and also to help. When something is so painful, I think sometimes we absorb some of that pain. And I think, being able to be with them in that space and kind of, we don't take it on, but we absorb some of it so that they can say out loud what's maybe really challenging or really hard. So again, to answer your question, I think it's being there with them, but being willing to move when they're ready to move.
When they're ready. Great. Well, let's see. What do you think is the long-term effect of all of this grief that we're experiencing with COVID and the loss of, all the losses we've had this year? How do you think this grief is going to show itself in the future?
That's a really
good question.
I just recently have been reading a book by, what's her name, Dr. Jennifer Aniston, and she is a medical doctor with Good Morning America or something, and she is talking about how we have to accept, and I don't really like this word, but I understand what she's saying. We have to accept that this is the new normal. That things aren't going to get back to the way they ever were, and that really is grief, And I think so. I think we have to accept that there are going to be some challenges, and that life is different. But we're resilient, I think we are able to adapt and adjust. But I think the long-term effect is yet to be seen with children. We hear so much about kids in school and, those kinds of things. How is it all going to play out? But then on the other side of that, I'm just so pleased to hear the other side of it. I have a school counselor that called me, and she wants me and somebody from the Children's Bereavement Center to come out and, what can we do to help our kids, And so, on some levels, I'm fearful, but I'm also hopeful. I'm hopeful because one thing about the pandemic is it's made grief so real for us as a world. And, I think in my experience with people in grief, sometimes it's the people that have lost someone and really dealing with that, they're doing a lot better than the rest of the world because they've come to terms with the fact that this is real. And yeah, so it's such a good question and something worth pursuing and thinking about and obviously praying about.
Yeah, for sure. Nargis says, I'm assuming stage of grief follows some sort of trauma. Can you talk a bit about moving from trauma to grief? I believe the world, like Texas, humanity, we are in a tremendous place of trauma, anger. Grief is yet still far away.
Yeah, that is such a good observation and a reminder that, frankly, I don't think we can grieve until we've dealt with the trauma. And how do we deal with trauma? I think, for one thing, we have to normalize that as well. We always talk about normalizing grief. And when we normalize something, we allow people to experience it or talk about it so that they can, that they know that there's not something wrong with them, that they know that there isn't, like, I think sometimes when people do trauma, it's like, oh, they don't want to talk about it or they want to avoid it. And so I think in response to that is, I think, normalizing the trauma and really being able to sit with people in trauma is really challenging, but it's so important.
Yeah, sometimes that's all they need. Just be there.
Yeah.
Be there.
Isn't it funny that we often say that you just have to be there? It's funny when we say just, it's like we kind of minimize that. And yet that is often the best gift that we could give somebody is our presence. And yet we kind of minimize it. Oh, I don't know what I could just be there. Yeah, please. Can you come over now, right now, please?
I loved how when you opened your talk and you said that, that when people think about a trauma, think about their grief, what did people say or do? And it was the ones that just showed up. That's what you remember. That's what I remember in dealing with this. Yeah.
And I guess the ministry, sometimes my colleague and I, Celeste, are asked to go to, maybe there's been something that happens at a school or whatever. And what we've learned is, we don't go in with any answers. We go in and let people ask the questions, and the questions that they have to share, really, they don't expect answers. They know that we don't have the answers, but they want somebody to listen to them. They want somebody to hear that they're scared or they're frightened or they're apprehensive. So again, I think how we respond to trauma is not to be afraid of it, because there's already the fear factor for them, but to be in that space with them. Nargis, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Nargis. What are some of the favorite ways that you've witnessed people grieve? And are you a fan of any special rituals? That's from Mary.
That's a really good question. Well, I have to say lighting candles is significant. I think how many times I've heard somebody say, at a Thanksgiving dinner table when they didn't think they could do anything else, but somebody gets up and, maybe, through the tears say, well, we got to say something about Grandpa. And so they start sharing, so, and I realize I hope I'm not going over on time here, but I just want to tell one quick story about that. I did a Grief in the Holiday, and there was this lady that shared how she had a grandson, and he came over to her house. But before he came over, her daughter came in, and she was right in the middle of her grief, and she wasn't really ready to celebrate anything. So the daughter says, "Mom, you got to have a Christmas tree up." And she said, "Well, if you want a Christmas tree up, why don't you put one up?" And so put a Christmas tree up. And then the 12-year-old grandson came in and he says, "Grandma, how come there's nothing on the Christmas tree?" And she said, "Well," my grandson said, well, what do you think should be on the Christmas tree?" I get tearful when I ever tell this story. He said, how about some of Grandpa's ties? And so now I've kept in touch with her, and and what's so cool is that now that's become a tradition, and what I want to say about that is, do you see how that turned from a trigger to a touchstone? It was something that was so painful, but now they gather and they celebrate, and it's like they can't wait to put up the Christmas tree with Grandpa's, ties on it. So, I mean, that's the creative things that I think can happen with rituals. So, I think that's my favorite one.
That's a great one. I had a Julie Woody, who a lot of you know, did a memorial service for one of our patients, and she told this, and it really stuck with me. She talked about we all have 3 deaths. First one is the physical death, when we actually pass. The second death is the funeral. You will never see them again. They're either buried or cremated. But that third death is when that last person passes that can no longer tell their story. Mm-hmm. So as long as people are alive and they can tell the story and share them, they're still living and they're still with us.
Well, and look at that. That was Coco, the movie.
Yeah.
It was such a great movie. And, I thought it was such a great way to teach about death, but also that we live on by telling those stories. And mm-hmm. And again, going back to, conversation that I had with Arthur, that, how important it is to tell our story when we're alive, but also then to have that story so it can be continued. And Bob Niemeyer, who I've come to respect a lot too in his work with grief, and he basically says that we have a story. First, our story is shattered, and then we kind of start to tell the story, and then we start to integrate it, and we start to we create a new story, and I think that's really what grief work is creating a new story. And actually, the 2 handouts that I shared with you, the one is by Ellen Wolfelt, who is just a great grief resource person. And I love what he writes about being a companion. And he's a grief therapist. And he's basically saying, if you're a grief therapist or if you're a volunteer, both need to be companions. You can't have one that's out there leading. One you have to go alongside of. And I love that concept. And the other one that that I shared really is, I think, a great example of the new identity that comes as a result of grief, because we are new people. And so, when you first experience the loss of someone very, very near and dear, someone that you love very much, I mean, you don't want to hear about a new identity, but the reality is that's what resilience is. That's what adapting and adjusting is. But it's not without pain, it's not without going through the process of grief. So, you can't just get to that place that I'm just going to remember them without having those feelings of like my colleague Celeste says, you have to go backwards in order to go forward. And I think we have to be able to go back and process the difficult stuff, but in processing the difficult stuff, we start remembering more and more of the good stuff. So it's and again, I think in our culture, we have this thing about everybody's supposed to be smiling all the time. Well, life isn't like that. And I think in some ways, resilient people are people that can be able to adapt to adversity. And one of the things that I'm learning, I did an Alzheimer's support group just yesterday, and just to hear people talk about how this one guy put it so well. And you asked about anticipatory grief. He said, when I first heard that my wife had Alzheimer's, he said, I got so angry. And he said, but then when I processed those feelings, he used the word, I love this. He said, I navigated through those feelings. Then all of a sudden I started to realize, well, we still could do some stuff, And again, I think what I heard him saying in that is he acknowledged his loss. But she hadn't died, but he acknowledged the loss. So I think even in anticipatory grief, if we can help people name the losses, they'll do better with their grief. So the loss of independence, the loss of somebody being able to speak, or the loss of being able to have conversation. I think when we're with people before death, if we can help them name those losses, I think that's what helps us in them coming to terms with their grief.
Really helpful. Yeah. Mary says, I've always heard that you should never make a big decision or a big move until at least a year after your loved one dies. Based on your experience with grieving folks, how do you feel about that as a timeline?
I think it's really wise. I think it's good advice, but I also will tell you, it kind of depends on the kind of relationship that the person has had and the kind of death. For example, if someone has been living with someone that has had Alzheimer's and has dealt with a lot of those losses, they maybe are ready to make some decisions. And I have kind of a funny story that, funny is that the word? Oh, I smile when I tell it. I was doing this, so working with hospice, and this lady came to me from one of the groups, and she said, "I don't like that guy." And I said, "Why is that?" "I don't know." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, this is a support group. He's hitting on me." And I said, "Okay." I thought that isn't appropriate. So I sat down to visit with him. Well, the reality was that, you know, his wife had Alzheimer's. She died about a year ago. So he was in a different space. So I suggested St. Matthew's Social Club. I thought that was a good place for him because that's where he was ready to be, you know? And what's beautiful about that, they really had a support group for people who were widowed and who were looking for relationships. But you see how so to answer that question, to just say always, I would say no, but I think it's really wise not to make emotional decisions, because that's what it would be when you do. So,
and to really recognize that people are in a different place.
Right.
Maybe, yeah. Nargis says, today is my mother's birthday.
Oh.
She died 8 years ago, and I still send a happy birthday, Mom, to my family. How long to keep remembering her birthday? Forever and ever and ever? You know, is there a timeline on all this?
I think Nargis will. Yeah. Well, Nargis, what was your mother's name?
Her name is Molly.
Molly. Yeah.
Yeah, she's from Britain.
Happy birthday, Molly.
Yeah, Molly.
Happy birthday, Molly. We're
Thank
thinking
you.
of you. Oh. You know, part of my ritual to help me with the grief of losing, you know, patients that I've come really close to is like the post-death visit, you know, because I not only grieve the loss of the patient, but their families.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we become close. Some of these people I've seen for years, and then attend the services, and then just send a card to remind them I'm thinking of them on the anniversary of the death, or what are their big firsts, like the first Christmas.
No.
And you know, it just kind of helps me put them in a loving place,
Mm-hmm.
and remind me that I haven't forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a social worker that Arthur and I had worked with, Lucy. She had talked about how we're in this really important picture at that point in time in somebody's life, those of us that work with end-of-life care. And it's like they can't imagine life without us there. And in many ways, that's what makes it so sacred and so special, you know, because we are in that picture that made all the difference for them, but it also makes a difference for us, and to be able to honor our own grief. And I think that's a good thing to reflect on in terms of, you know, abode. Do we honor our own grief? Because we experience it, and it's so important to show self-compassion to ourselves as well as those that we serve. I'm wondering if, go ahead. I'm wondering if there's somebody here that I'd like, Mary, could you put up the prayer for blessing for this place between? Do you have that? And I'm wondering if somebody would be willing to read this. To me, I think it's such a powerful prayer that reminds us that when we're in grief, we are in this place of creating a new identity for ourselves. And so would there be somebody that would be willing to read it for us?
I could read it. I have it in front of me.
Okay.
Okay. Blessing for the place between. When you come to the place between, when you have left what you held most dear, when you are traveling toward the life you know not, when you arrive at the hardest ground, may it become for you a place to rest. May it become for you a place to dream. May the pain that has pressed itself into you give way to vision, to knowing. May the morning make of it an altar, a path, a place to begin again.
Well, that, my friends, is grief. And grief changes. One of my favorite quotes is by Queen Elizabeth at the bombing of Twin Harbor, or of the Twin Towers. She said, grief is the tariff we pay for love. And so I think as we acknowledge that as a tariff, I think we know that it's a price we pay because we love. And I think that's what makes grief also, it's difficult, but also grief changes. So grief changes as we, are able to embrace it. Like Narges was able to say happy birthday to her mom, and probably in a way that wasn't as painful as it was 8 years ago, but still a connection with her. So I think it's so important to recognize that that grief continually changes. And somebody in a group once asked the question, how long does grief last? And I was struggling for the answer because, I thought I was supposed to have the answer for anything anybody asked. And some lady saved me. She said, it lasts as long as it lasts. And I thought, great answer. So that's been my answer ever since. It lasts as long as it needs to last. So, and I don't see grief now as something that's bad. Grief is not the enemy. Grief is what we need to experience healing. And that's why we say grief is normal and natural and necessary. And it's because if we didn't have grief, we would have a lot of unattended things happening in our life. We would have lots of, we'd have more pathology than we have right now. So we need good grief. So,
amen. Oh, thank you so much. This was wonderful, wonderful. And we appreciate you being here with us, Darwin.
You are so welcome. And one thing I just want to say, if you know people that would like to be part of any of our groups, they're free and they're for the community as well as for the funeral home. And so I'll send that over to you, Mary, so you can have it. They're all virtual groups. So I do a women's support group on Monday mornings. I've got about 18 women in that. We have a group that meets on Tuesday, and that's for people who've lost children of any age. And then we have a couple groups for men as well. So, and next Tuesday, I'm actually starting a 6-week Life After Loss group, which is for anyone that might have experienced a loss, any kind of loss. So if that's something that's of interest to you, just feel free to contact me and we'll give you more information.
Oh, that's wonderful. And could we find these on like theporterlowering.org or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, folks, that's it.
That's it.
Thank you for joining us for the past 6 weeks. And boy, it went fast. And I hope you all learned something and can share some of this wonderful information with friends and family and got some questions answered during this time. So remember, you'll get an email tomorrow for just a quick survey of tonight's program, and then please put your suggestions for further ABODE academies, because we're going to continue to do this. I think it's a wonderful outreach for the community. It's a great way to get the word out, and talk about things that people don't always want to talk about or know to talk about.
Right.
Well, I just wanted to end by sharing a little bit more about this.
Oh, yes.
This year, I decided, I love this card so much, I decided to make it my Christmas card. So, and somebody had shared this quote with me, so I borrowed it. And I put in there, I said, 2020 was not to be the year to get what we want, but to be the year to be thankful for what we have. Moving forward to 2021 with trust, hope, and resiliency.
Oh my gosh.
Peace.
Peace. And it's funny, we all said those words.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was so cool. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.
Thank you.
This was just great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Mary.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.